The rain came first, thick, tropical, relentless, hammering down on corrugated tin and bamboo huts until the whole camp sounded like a drumbeat of despair. Beneath that curtain of water, mud swallowed everything: boots, bones, and faith. The guards moved through it with rifles slung low, their faces blank under straw hats. But inside Hut 12, a man was fighting for something far rarer than survival. He was fighting for life in a place designed to erase it. Captain Arthur Whitley, U.S. Army Medical Corps, formerly of the 10th Field Hospital, now a prisoner of war under the Japanese Imperial Army. He had no instruments, no drugs, no anesthetic. His operating table was a bamboo cot, his light a guttering kerosene lamp, his tools scavenged from wreckage and miracles. On that night, the night the fever took 15 men, Whitley had only a rusted scalpel blade tied to a toothbrush handle, a kettle of boiled rainwater, and a prayer whispered through clenched teeth. He worked until dawn, his hands trembling from exhaustion and malnutrition, sweat and rain dripping into open wounds. Around him the dying waited in silence, their eyes sunk in hollows of yellow and gray. But when the sun rose over the Burma jungle, when the guards came to count the bodies, they found something they could not explain. The dead had not multiplied, they had diminished. Against all logic, against infection, starvation, and cruelty itself, Whitley had saved 12 men. And when the Japanese commandant demanded to know how, Whitley only said 4 words: scrap and hope. Sir, that phrase, spoken in a camp where hope was forbidden, would travel through whispers, through diaries smuggled home, through testimony decades later, until it became one of the most haunting truths of the Pacific War, that sometimes salvation came not from orders or weapons, but from the quiet defiance of a doctor with nothing left to lose. The war had not yet broken his body when they captured him, only his illusions. It was March 1942, the jungle of central Burma alive with artillery thunder. The 10th Field Hospital had been moving with the retreating British 1st Burma Division, setting up aid stations in whatever shade they could find along the crumbling road from Toungoo to Mandalay. The Japanese advance was relentless. Captain Arthur Whitley, 34, had been a surgeon in Manila before the war, a quiet man from Pennsylvania who believed medicine was proof that humanity could overcome destruction. He'd written home once that surgery is order in the midst of chaos, but the Burma campaign shattered that belief. He remembered the smell of the jungle after bombardment, burnt oil, gunpowder, and the faint sweetness of decaying vegetation. The screams of the wounded were constant, sometimes human, sometimes horses. Men came to him in pieces, torn limbs, scorched skin, eyes staring but not seeing. His hands worked mechanically, clamp, cut, stitch, move. His heart, he left somewhere along that retreating road. When the Japanese surrounded their convoy near Pinmana, Whitley refused evacuation. "My patients don't walk," he told his commanding officer. He stayed with the wounded, waving off the retreat trucks. At dawn, they were overrun. The first thing he noticed about captivity was the silence. After weeks of gunfire and shelling, the quiet was suffocating. The Japanese rounded up survivors, forcing them down the railway line with bayonets at their backs. The march was slow and endless, a trail of dying men stretching through the jungle, each step sinking into mud that smelled of rot. They called it the Burma Death Railway later. But in 1942 it had no name, only suffering. Whitley counted each man as they collapsed. He tore strips from his uniform to bind wounds, shared his last canteen of water, and whispered encouragement he barely believed. When a soldier named Jenkins begged him to leave him behind, Whitley lifted him instead, staggering until both men fell. The guards watched with indifference. To them, death was as common as rain. At the first camp, WWII, Whitley was assigned as the medical officer for over 200 Allied prisoners. The hospital was a bamboo shack with a dirt floor, swarming with flies. There were no medicines, no bandages, no antiseptic. Dysentery, malaria, and cholera spread like wildfire. He scavenged constantly. Rusted tin cans became kidney basins. Parachute silk became dressings. Old wire became sutures. He sterilized everything in boiling river water. Each morning began with the roll call, skeletal men standing in rows while guards shouted, striking anyone who faltered. Then came the labor, cutting through the jungle to build the railway that would connect Burma to Thailand, Japan's lifeline for conquest. The men returned at dusk bleeding and feverish, collapsing in mud that had once been their own sweat. Whitley moved among them with the slow rhythm of a ghost. He lost count of how many he buried, but every death became fuel for his stubborn defiance. He began to keep a secret notebook written on the backs of old supply manifests. It was a medical log, yes, but also something else. "I cannot fight," he wrote. "I can only keep them from forgetting what mercy looks like." The first miracle of scrap and hope came in June 1943. A prisoner named Corporal Linwood had an abscessed leg, infection spreading fast, gangrene climbing toward the thigh. Amputation was the only option. But there was no ether, no surgical saw, no assistant strong enough to hold him. Whitley stared at the leg for an hour before moving. He fashioned a tourniquet from a belt, sterilized a sharpened hacksaw blade in a pot of boiling water, and told Linwood to bite down on a bamboo stick. When it was over, the jungle was silent except for the doctor's ragged breathing. Linwood survived. The stump healed. The guards, curious, came to inspect the operation. One of them muttered, "Doctor-son, crazy man." But Whitley smiled faintly. Crazy men, he thought, build railways in hell. Months turned to years. The monsoon seasons came and went, washing away graves, erasing footprints. Whitley's beard grew white with mold and age. He began trading cigarettes for scraps of paper, scrawling recipes for antiseptic from boiled papaya leaves, notes on how to distill quinine from bark. He taught younger prisoners how to tend wounds, how to hide hope in labor. By late 1944, the camp was filled with ghosts that breathed. The Japanese, desperate for progress on the railway, drove the men harder. Beatings increased. Deaths came daily. But one thing kept the camp from collapsing: Whitley's ritual. Each night after the guards left, he walked through the huts, touching each sleeping man lightly on the shoulder, counting them. Not to mark the dying, but to remember the living. "Every life is a rebellion," he whispered once. "Every heartbeat says no." By the beginning of 1945, rumors spread through the prisoners like fire. The Allies were coming. Planes were seen overhead. The guards grew restless, crueler, uncertain. Supplies ran out entirely. Men began dying from starvation. Then one night in February, a cholera outbreak hit. It swept through the camp in hours, unstoppable, brutal. Whitley and the surviving orderlies worked without rest. He built makeshift IV lines from bamboo tubes and glass bottles, rigged with torn shoelaces. He mixed salt and sugar into boiled water for rehydration. He burned contaminated rags, ordered the sick isolated, forced the guards themselves to obey quarantine protocols. For 3 days, he didn't sleep. On the 4th, the outbreak stopped. 12 men recovered, including a guard who had fallen ill. When the Japanese commandant arrived, furious and bewildered, he demanded to know what magic Whitley had used. The doctor simply bowed and said, "Scrap and hope." The commandant stared at him for a long time, then nodded once. From that day forward, the guards brought him scraps willingly. Broken bottles, wire, cloth, not out of kindness, but out of awe. When liberation came months later in August 1945, the Allied paratroopers who entered the camp expected corpses. What they found were skeletons who still stood, who saluted weakly, who said, "The doctor is alive." They found Whitley in the infirmary, surrounded by patients, his face gaunt, but his hands steady. He refused evacuation until the last prisoner was on a stretcher. When they finally carried him out, he turned once to look at the huts. "I'll come back for the notebooks," he said. And he did. 2 years later, those notebooks were translated and published as The Wounded Road, a doctor's war without weapons. It was only then that the world learned how one man's scrap and hope had kept an entire camp from collapsing into the dark. Morning in the jungle began not with sunlight but with sound. The rhythmic thud of bamboo mallets driving rail spikes, the coughing of the sick, the murmured count of guards calling names through thick humidity. The air smelled of sweat, decay, and burnt rice. Overhead, the canopy filtered the dawn into a dim green haze that never quite felt like day. The camp stirred, hundreds of shadows moving in unison, driven by routine carved from punishment. Captain Arthur Whitley stood outside the infirmary hut, shirt clinging to his ribs, breath steady despite the hunger gnawing at his stomach. Around his neck hung a stethoscope that no longer worked, the tubing cracked, one earpiece missing. He wore it like armor, not function. In this place, symbols mattered as much as supplies. It reminded the prisoners that someone still carried the weight of healing. He looked across the yard at the line of men preparing for labor, the railway gang. Each was skeletal, hollow-eyed, their uniforms reduced to rags tied with twine. Yet every morning they turned and nodded to him before marching out through the gate. It was their unspoken ritual, acknowledgement that one of them still stood for something human. The camp had evolved into its own anatomy, a living organism of suffering and small defiance. The guards were its nervous system, unpredictable impulses of cruelty and control. The prisoners were its bones, brittle, unyielding, somehow holding the structure together. And Whitley was its heart, faint but beating. He had begun constructing a new infirmary, not with permission but with persistence. Over weeks he convinced the guards to let him repurpose discarded bamboo from collapsed huts. He promised better productivity, fewer deaths. They agreed, more from indifference than compassion. The result was a crude, open-air shelter with a dirt floor and a roof patched from tar paper and palm leaves. Inside, he built what he called the Ward of Hope. Each bed was a bamboo frame tied with vines. The mattresses were rice sacks stuffed with dried grass. The IV stands were made from carved saplings. Whitley scavenged discarded ration tins, flattening them into surgical trays. He cut strips from his own uniform for bandages, washing them in boiled water until the fabric disintegrated. At night, when the guards drank themselves to sleep, he wrote by lamplight in his hidden notebook, "The human body is the strongest machine I've ever seen. Even starved, beaten, and fevered, it still tries to heal. Perhaps God designed it for this very purpose, to endure beyond cruelty." It was during this time that Whitley met Lieutenant Kenji Sato, the new medical officer assigned to the camp. Sato was young, barely 28, with wire-rimmed glasses and a face that tried to appear stern but betrayed exhaustion. Unlike most guards, he spoke softly, his English halting but sincere. Their first meeting took place over a pile of broken medical crates. Sato gestured to the splintered wood and said, "Supplies. Old, that from Rangoon. Maybe you can use," Whitley crouched, opening one crate. Inside were shattered bottles, moldy bandages, a few rolls of gauze. Worthless to most, invaluable to him. "Thank you," he said simply. Sato nodded, then hesitated. "You still doctor?" Whitley looked up. "Always." For a moment, the jungle seemed to quiet between them. It was the first time in 3 years that a Japanese officer had addressed him as something other than prisoner. That night, Sato returned, watching as Whitley stitched a wound under lamplight. "Why you do this?" he asked. "They will die anyway." Whitley didn't stop working. "Because one of them might not," Sato frowned. "Even if enemy?" Whitley's eyes flicked up. "I treat the sick, not the sides." Something changed in Sato's expression. Not agreement, not defiance, but understanding. Weeks later, the doctor's defiance would be tested again. A train derailment along the line brought dozens of new prisoners, many with crushed limbs and burns. The guards panicked. Disease could spread. Sato came to Whitley in the night, whispering, "They say leave them. Too sick." Whitley's answer was immediate. "Bring them here." For 3 days, the infirmary became a battlefield. The stench of infection filled the air. Whitley operated on the floor, using river water to rinse wounds, his hands trembling from exhaustion. He made splints from bamboo poles, cauterized bleeding with heated metal spoons. When the commandant came to inspect, his boots sinking into the mud, he demanded to know why these men had not been left to die. Whitley, too tired to bow, simply said, "Because I can't stop being what I am." The guard raised his hand, "Rewire," but Sato stepped forward. "He helped our men too," he said quietly. "He saved lives." The hand dropped. The commandant turned without another word. For the first time, Whitley realized the strange power of his defiance. It wasn't rebellion through violence, but through compassion. In a place built to destroy identity, he had made humanity subversive. By late 1944, rumors reached the camp that Japan was losing the war. The guards grew anxious, discipline fraying. Food rations dwindled to watery rice and rotten fish. Disease surged again, malaria, beriberi, scabies. Whitley's own legs swelled from malnutrition, his eyesight fading. Yet he refused to stop. He performed surgery one morning on a prisoner named O'Connor. A shrapnel wound turned septic. His scalpel had dulled, so he sharpened it on a rock. He poured boiling water over the wound, cutting through flesh that felt like paper. O'Connor survived. The men began to whisper that the doctor was touched by angels, but Whitley knew better. Not angels, he told them. Just persistence. The next miracle came from the unlikeliest of sources, a pile of engine parts. After an air raid on a nearby Japanese depot, debris was hauled into the camp. Among it, Whitley found fragments of rubber tubing and metal valves. He spent nights assembling them into what looked like a crude pump. When he demonstrated it to Sato, the young officer stared in disbelief. Machine for blood? An irrigation pump, Whitley corrected. To clean wounds, Sato touched the handle. You make from scrap? Scrap and hope, Whitley said again. Word spread among the prisoners. The pump became a symbol, proof that creation was still possible in destruction. They began scavenging for him, bringing bits of wire, bottle glass, broken knives. The camp's trash became its lifeline. But with each small triumph came greater risk. One night, guards discovered the hidden journal, Whitley's record of operations and deaths. To them, it looked like espionage. They dragged him to the commandant's hut, shoving him to his knees. The officer demanded, "Why you write?" "You spy?" Whitley's mouth was dry. "I write names," he said. "So they aren't forgotten." The officer struck him across the face with a bamboo cane. "No names. Only numbers." Blood dripped down his chin. He whispered, "Not to me." The beating lasted minutes. The pain would linger for months. But when he returned to the infirmary, his men stood silently, watching him limp through the door. One of them whispered, "Doctor, they can't kill what you are." And they didn't. When the rains returned in 1945, the camp drowned again in mud and fever. But this time something had changed. The prisoners carried themselves differently. They shared rations without orders, repaired huts together, sang in low voices at night. Hope had become contagious. Sato, now gaunt and haunted, came to Whitley one evening. "Japan, finished," he said quietly. "Soon. Maybe over." Whitley nodded, too tired to smile. "Then make sure you survive too." Sato looked at him with something like sorrow. "After war, people forget us," Whitley said softly. "Then we must not forget ourselves." When the surrender came, the guards vanished. The gates were left open. The jungle beyond buzzed with the same indifferent life it always had. Whitley walked out barefoot, his stethoscope still hanging from his neck. Behind him, hundreds followed, men who should have been dead but weren't. No trumpet, no victory march. Only the sound of feet in mud moving toward freedom. The fever line began as a whisper, a thin, invisible boundary across the camp floor where the dying were separated from the living. A line drawn not by guards, but by infection itself. It crept like smoke through the huts in the last months of the war, when the jungle air grew thick and unmoving and the flies came in clouds. By then, Captain Arthur Whitley's body was as frail as the men he tended. His ribs pressed sharp through skin burned by fever. His eyes yellowed from malaria, yet he refused to cross that line to rest. Each morning he rose before dawn, his legs trembling, and stepped over the fevered men lying in the mud, whispering their names softly to remind them they were still human. Dysentery, cholera, and malnutrition ravaged what little strength remained among the prisoners. The camp's bamboo huts had become ovens reeking of rot, feces, and rain. The guards no longer barked orders, they merely watched, fearful of contagion, their rifles limp in their hands. Whitley's infirmary overflowed, its walls streaked with soot from the oil lamp that never went out. The doctor had long since run out of medicine. He made antiseptic from papaya sap, penicillin from mold scraped off spoiled bread, saline from boiled salt water. Each solution was a prayer disguised as science. When the rations ended, he bartered for rice husks, crushed and mixed them with water to keep his patients alive a little longer. His hands shook constantly, not from fear but from starvation. Still, they never faltered when holding a scalpel. The fever took men in their sleep, stealing them quietly while others dreamed of rescue. But Whitley would not let them die alone. He sat beside each man until breath stopped, closing eyes that once belonged to soldiers, now just shadows of sons and brothers. One night, as thunder rolled across the Burmese sky, a prisoner named Hargreaves woke screaming, delirious, raving that the river was on fire. Whitley held him down, whispering, "It's just the rain, lad." It's just the rain. When the man died an hour later, Whitley wrote his name in the last corner of his notebook and drew a small cross. That page was soaked through with sweat and blood, the ink blurred but legible. It was the last entry he ever wrote. Days later, Lieutenant Sato entered the hut carrying a small bundle, rags soaked in medicine scavenged from a Japanese aid station. He placed them on Whitley's table without a word. The doctor looked up, his face hollow but grateful. Sato bowed deeply, whispering in broken English, "For the doctor who saves even his enemies." It was an act of treason for a Japanese officer to aid a prisoner, but the war had already dissolved the rules of men. In that moment, both knew they were simply survivors trapped in the machinery of a dying empire. The fever line blurred. Prisoners and guards alike fell sick. Whitley treated them all. No questions, no hatred, just the same trembling compassion he had given since the first day. When the Allied bombers came, distant thunder echoing like judgment, the men in the infirmary thought it was the sound of God arriving. On the morning the bombing stopped, silence fell heavier than any explosion. The commandant was gone. The guards fled into the trees, and Sato was nowhere to be found. Whitley, too weak to stand, crawled to the hut's doorway and saw sunlight cutting through the mist. Real sunlight, not filtered by fear. For the first time in years, he heard birds instead of moans. The fever line, once drawn in dirt, had vanished. Around him lay men too weak to rise, but alive. He smiled faintly, whispered, "You made it," and collapsed against the doorframe, half conscious, half free. When Allied paratroopers arrived days later, they found the camp silent except for the hum of insects. In the center of the infirmary, under a tattered flag of white cloth stained with blood and mud, the doctor still sat upright, breathing shallowly, his stethoscope hanging like a medal over his chest. They carried him out gently, unsure if he lived or dreamed. The fever had not broken his body entirely, just the world around it, and as they bore him toward the waiting trucks, the wind stirred through the palm leaves, whispering over the graves, carrying one phrase from the doctor's parched lips before he drifted into unconsciousness: "Scrap and hope." The sky above Thanbuzayat burned red the morning the war ended. No announcement reached the camp, no officer's declaration or bugle's call, only the sudden, unnatural silence that came when the shouting stopped. The guards were gone, their barracks empty, rifles left in the dirt like snakes that had shed their skins. The prisoners woke in confusion, some too weak to stand, others staring at the open gates as if it were a mirage. For years, those bamboo fences had been the edge of their world. Now they swayed in the wind, useless, almost pitiful. Captain Arthur Whitley blinked into the dawn from his cot. He was alive, though the word no longer carried meaning. His beard had turned the color of ash, his uniform a patchwork of blood and rot. Every breath rattled through ribs that had forgotten flesh. Yet when he saw the gates open, he knew something irreversible had shifted. The machinery of cruelty had finally run out of fuel. The survivors gathered slowly, a congregation of bones and rags, their eyes hollow but alert. They did not cheer. They did not cry. They simply waited. Whitley dragged himself upright, leaning on a bamboo cane. He limped toward the center of the yard where the old roll call post stood like a gallows. A single word escaped his cracked lips: "Free." It sounded foreign in the heavy air. A few men laughed then, brittle, almost hysterical laughter that broke into coughing. Others sank to their knees. One kissed the ground. Whitley watched them and felt nothing at first, only the distant pulse of disbelief. Then slowly tears formed, tracing clean paths down the dirt on his face. The jungle beyond the fence shimmered in heat, endless and green. The same jungle that had devoured thousands, now offering escape. But freedom, he knew, was not the end of the sickness. It was merely a new kind of test. The men who could still walk set out to search for food, for the enemy, for answers. They found only silence. Villages burned to ash, rail tracks twisted by air raids, bodies left where they'd fallen. The war had ended not in victory here, but in exhaustion. When the first Allied patrol arrived days later, Australians moving cautiously through the undergrowth, they found Whitley standing barefoot at the edge of the jungle. His stethoscope hung around his neck, his eyes hollow but steady. He raised one trembling hand and said, "We're all accounted for." The soldiers stared in disbelief. They had expected corpses, not command. Behind him, 200 men stood in formation, Gaunt yet disciplined, their posture almost military. It was the last order Whitley ever gave. The rescue teams brought trucks, medics, supplies, real food, real medicine, cigarettes. The prisoners flinched at kindness. They'd forgotten the language of mercy. When nurses approached with water, some wept. Others refused to drink, suspecting a trick. Whitley moved among them, reassuring in whispers, "It's all right. You're safe now." He said it so often that it became prayer rather than fact. In Rangoon, the hospitals overflowed with the liberated. Doctors there could scarcely believe Whitley's condition. Half-starved, riddled with infection, fevered beyond endurance, yet somehow alive. They treated him like a miracle. But he insisted on working, helping translate medical records, identifying the dead, and writing names for families who would never know graves. He slept little. He told one nurse, "If I stop moving, I'll remember." When peace was declared and the great ships carried the survivors home, Whitley refused immediate evacuation. He stayed behind with a small group of medics to document the camps. He walked the length of the Burma Railway step by step, through rain and jungle. For every half-mile, he stopped to write in a small field book. He catalogued the dead, marking sites with makeshift crosses carved from railway timber. His notebook filled with coordinates, fragments of hymns, sketches of bones half buried in moss. It was on that journey that he found Lieutenant Sato again, or what was left of him. Near a burned-out depot by Kanchanaburi, Whitley came across a group of surrendered Japanese officers under guard. Among them, a thin man in tattered khaki raised his eyes and whispered, "Dr. San." Sato's hair had turned gray, his glasses cracked, his hands trembling. The British sergeant escorting him said, "You know this one?" Whitley nodded. "He was one of us." They spoke briefly through the wire. Sato bowed low and murmured, "I break orders. I help. You remember?" Whitley's throat tightened. "I remember." Sato's eyes filled. "Then I die clean." 2 weeks later, he was executed with others under military tribunal. Whitley wrote his name in the same notebook as the men he'd saved, drawing no distinction. Beneath it, he wrote, "Not enemy. Not friend. Human." Months passed before Whitley boarded a hospital ship bound for San Francisco. The sea was calm, the sunsets vast and mercilessly beautiful. The ship's motion lulled the wounded into uneasy sleep. Some nights the doctor wandered the deck alone, staring into the horizon, the salt wind stinging his hollow cheeks. The ocean reminded him of the camp, endless, indifferent, alive. He thought often of the phrase that had defined him, "Scrap and hope." It seemed absurd now, almost childish, yet it had carried him through hell. On the final night before landfall, he took out the small, tattered notebook that had survived everything, the one filled with names, formulas, sketches, and prayers, and he read aloud into the sea. When the nurses found him later, he was sitting on the deck, eyes closed, the notebook resting on his knees. He was smiling faintly, as if the sea itself had answered. Years later, long after the war faded into history books, a letter arrived at the U.S. Army Medical Archives in Washington. It was from a former prisoner, now an old man living in Sydney. Inside was a single page yellowed with age. Captain Whitley died in 1948. He never spoke of the camp again. But every Sunday he would walk to the small hospital in our town. He would sit by the beds of dying men, veterans, strangers, and simply hold their hands. When someone asked him why, he said, "Because once no one should have lived, and they did." The archivist filed the letter under Humanitarian Service, Pacific Theater. But one clerk, curious, copied the phrase "scrap and hope" into the margin. That note, almost lost in bureaucracy, would one day resurface in a museum exhibit decades later. Labeled simply, words found in a POW doctor's diary, WWII Camp, Burma, and there, beneath glass, beside photographs of skeletal men smiling faintly at liberation, the words endured, not as history but as testimony. For those who saw them, it was impossible not to feel the echo of the jungle, the smell of rain, the sound of breathing in the dark. The war had ended, but the anatomy of defiance lived on, in a doctor who rebuilt hope from scrap, and in the silence that followed when humanity, once forgotten, remembered itself again. The world had moved on. Cities rebuilt themselves with steel and neon. Nations redrew their borders, and the sound of engines replaced the silence of graves. But for those who had survived the jungle, time did not heal. It only rearranged the scars. Captain Arthur Whitley lived quietly in Pennsylvania after returning home, though home was no longer a place but a fragile idea. He built a small clinic on the edge of town, serving miners and farmers who paid him with bread, labor, or nothing at all. The townspeople called him Doc Whitley, never guessing that the gentle man who stitched their wounds once stitched men back together in a prison built from despair. His patients saw calm, his neighbors saw kindness. Only at night, when rain struck the tin roof of his clinic, did he hear again the rhythm of the Burma camp, the hammering rain, the whispered roll calls, the fevered breath of dying men. Sometimes he would wake in darkness, reaching for the kerosene lamp that wasn't there, whispering names he'd long since written down. He kept the notebook locked in his desk drawer, wrapped in the same bandage cloth that had once bound the sick. The pages were fragile now, the ink fading to brown, the paper soft from humidity and time. Every few weeks he opened it to reread a name, Hargreaves, Linwood, Sato, and for a moment the years dissolved. His hands, though stiff with age, still moved as if remembering where the scalpel should go, how to steady the trembling, how to choose hope over surrender. But memory was heavier than any instrument. He carried it in silence, never boasting, never explaining. When local veterans invited him to speak about his service, he declined politely. "I was only a doctor," he'd say, and that was all. Yet the past had a way of finding him. In 1952, a letter arrived from London. It was from the Imperial War Graves Commission, requesting his help identifying unmarked sites along the Burma-Thailand Railway. They had found skeletal remains and fragments of medical gear. Among them was a rusted tin can with faintly etched letters, AW. The letter asked if he could confirm ownership. Whitley stared at it for a long time. That can had once been his kidney basin, improvised, scrubbed clean hundreds of times. The metal had outlived its maker's suffering. He returned the form with a single line, "Yes, that was mine. Please bury it with the others." The request awoke something he thought long dormant. That winter he began traveling, and not far but to hospitals, veterans' homes, and schools. He spoke softly to students about medicine in war, about how healing was an act of rebellion. "When you help someone live," he told them, "you defeat every enemy that ever existed." The audiences were small, but his words spread quietly, passed along by those who'd never fought but somehow understood. Newspapers ran small articles. Local doctor once POW, saved dozens with makeshift tools. The story sounded almost mythical, yet Whitley always corrected reporters. "Not dozens," he said. "Hundreds helped one another. I was only their witness." In 1955, an invitation arrived from Tokyo. Japan had rebuilt itself into a gleaming promise of modernity, but the war still lingered in the shadows of men's memories. The Japanese Red Cross requested that Whitley attend a humanitarian conference, to speak not of vengeance but reconciliation. He hesitated for weeks before accepting. When he stepped off the plane at Haneda, the air smelled faintly of rain and sea, too much like Burma. He walked through the crowds, head bowed, feeling the weight of history in every bowed greeting. On the second day of the conference, a translator approached him with a sealed envelope. "From an old family in Kyoto," she said. Inside was a small photograph of a young Japanese officer in a medical uniform, Lieutenant Kenji Sato. On the back, in careful handwriting, was a line in English. He said you were the only good memory he took into death. Whitley stood motionless for a long time. The hall around him filled with applause for another speaker, but the sound faded. In his mind, he saw again the fever ward, Sato's trembling hands holding out those soaked rags, the moment when enemy became human. That night, Whitley walked alone through Tokyo's lantern-lit streets until dawn, finally realizing that the war had not ended in 1945. It ended only when the remembering was shared. When he returned home, he donated the notebook to the Smithsonian. The curator, a young woman with steady hands, promised it would be preserved under glass, climate-controlled, catalogued. But Whitley made her promise something else. "Don't display it as tragedy," he said. "Display it as proof." She asked him, "Proof of what?" He smiled. "That hope doesn't need permission." The exhibit opened years later, titled Medicine Behind Barbed Wire. Visitors stood in silence before the notebook, The faded ink barely legible, but the weight of it unmistakable. Children pressed their faces to the glass. Veterans wept quietly. One visitor, a Japanese doctor on exchange from Osaka, wrote in the guest book, "He treated us all." As age crept upon him, Whitley began to slow. His hands no longer held steady, his vision blurred, but his voice remained strong. In 1960, he delivered his final lecture at Johns Hopkins University. The hall was packed. Students, soldiers, journalists, doctors. He spoke without notes. "I have seen the best of humanity in the worst of places," he began. "You don't fight despair with bullets. You fight it with compassion, with the smallest act. A cup of water, a stitch in the dark, a whisper that says, 'Hold on.' Every life saved is a rebellion against the abyss." When he finished, the room was silent for a long moment, then erupted into applause. But Whitley, ever modest, simply nodded once and left through a side door. That night he sat alone on his porch watching the rain fall through the glow of a street lamp, and for the first time in decades, he felt peace. The rain no longer sounded like the jungle. It sounded like home. Arthur Whitley died in 1962 at the age of 54. His funeral was small. Former patients, veterans, and nurses stood in the drizzle as the minister read a passage from his own writing. "Scrap and hope, two things no war can destroy." When they lowered the casket, one of the men from his old unit placed a rusted scalpel, the same kind he had once tied to a toothbrush handle, on top. "He used this to save us," the man said, voice trembling. "Now it's his turn to rest." Years later, in 1983, a documentary crew uncovered his story while researching forgotten medics of the Pacific. They interviewed survivors, historians, and one woman who claimed to be Whitley's nurse during liberation. She recalled walking into the infirmary that day. The air smelled of death and rain, but there he was, still working like the war had never ended. He looked up and said, "You made it." I realized later he wasn't talking to me. He was talking to all of us. The documentary aired worldwide. Letters poured into the network from across continents. Soldiers, doctors, even former Japanese families writing in gratitude. One note read simply, "Because of him, I chose medicine instead of revenge." Today, in a quiet corner of the Smithsonian, his notebook still rests beneath glass. The paper is brittle, the ink faint, but one phrase remains perfectly visible, etched by a trembling hand that refused surrender. Every heartbeat says no. And if you stand long enough in that hall, under the low hum of lights, you can almost hear the jungle rain again, the rhythm of defiance, the sound of life stitched back together by a man who turned scrap into salvation, and hope into a weapon stronger than war itself.